Friends, great to have you with us again. James, very nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too, Ian. Yeah.
Are you
And
well?
if I might say so,
Oh, yes.
happy birthday to you.
Thank you very much. That's a giveaway on the day of the day of the recording, isn't it?
It is a little bit, if people know your birthday, obviously.
That is true. Okay. By the time everyone's watching this, the day will have long passed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it all
There we go.
faded into the memory.
Indeed, indeed. Yes, another one tucked away. So
Yeah.
good. Fred, we ought to remind folks, just before we plunge into the detail of our text today, there are 4 things we love people to do, aren't there, James?
Yes, we'd love you to like the videos. That helps the algorithm, and also to subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. You're just sort of visiting, as it were.
Yeah.
Do share the video on the social media, whatever.
Yeah, you click on the button and copy the link and then post it wherever. Yep.
Platform is, and then do comment either on YouTube or on the blog.
We do get a variety of comments, don't we? Some discussions provoke quite a lot of discussion. Comment in the comments, so that's that's always encouraging, isn't it?
It's always interesting what people pick up. On their different contexts. Yeah,
and people often lob in some interesting insights too.
They do, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, where are we in the lectionary, James?
Right, we're heading a Trinity 14, so the year is marching on, and we're Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 to 20, which, as we've probably spoken about before, Matthew has these 5 blocks of teaching from Jesus, and this is the 4th block, teaching about the church. So we've had the Sermon on the Mount, we've had the teaching about mission in Matthew 10.
Yep.
We've had the teaching about the kingdom of God in Matthew 13.
Yep.
Into this bit here in Matthew 18, and then the last bit, which is about the church, and then the last bit is about the eschaton and the end of all things.
Yeah, the last ones are the last things. So that's
the last ones, exactly.
Yeah. Now, just 2 observations there, because I've been doing a little bit of writing on these things, and I just noticed that there is a kind of logical progression for these 5 units, which is interesting because, particularly with the parable, for instance, the parable of the sower that Matthew puts, in chapter 13, of course, Mark has at the beginning. Well, it's this
right at the beginning, Mark 4, yeah.
So I was reflecting, does this sort of order of Jesus' teaching make sense? And it seems to me that the logic is, this is what it means to be my disciple. If you're my disciple, you will then be sent out to make other disciples.
Yeah.
When you do that, this is how the kingdom grows. But of course, you'll gather together with other disciples. So this is the kind of life you lead. But all of this is heading towards a goal. And we sort of
that's a very nice.
That does seem to me to make sense in terms of an order. And I don't know if other people have sort of observed that or written about that at all.
It's very interesting because it's helpful in terms of, I think it's a helpful scheme because it helps you sort of focus on what, in a sense, Jesus is saying is important, and that there is a direction. Keeping eschatology is what we forget about most easily, I think.
Well, I don't, because I've written on it a lot. But
generally,
as
the church, as Christians, there is a sort of tendency to kind of forget about the very substantial amount of teaching Jesus gives about the eschaton, actually. And it tends to be the bit that's ignored, really. Whereas kind of passages like this
are the ones
are difficult, kind of clearly have practical.
So the order is: follow me, tell others, see the kingdom grow, order your life together, and look forward to the end.
Yeah,
there you go. That's the gospel in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah, great.
There was one other thing that I also noticed looking at these 5 things, which is that each of the sections has a very clear conclusion to it. So at the end of this chapter, it says, after Jesus had finished saying these words, and you get that same phrase. In Greek is exactly the same phrase. Or whatever it is. So after Jesus had finished saying these things. Now, it's really interesting that they each end with that same phrase. So it marks it very clearly. But actually, it's interesting they don't always begin with a clear introduction.
No.
Now, I find that's quite interesting because this gospel would have primarily been received orally, heard.
Yes.
Heard, read. So actually, you wouldn't notice that there are these 5 blocks of teaching. If you look at it, scan it through on a text, and you've got to read it. You see it's very obvious. But listening to it, you suddenly go, "Oh gosh, this is Jesus teaching a lot of stuff." And you suddenly realize that, and then you get this conclusion. So it's quite an interesting dynamic in terms of how.
And it's difficult because we can't kind of fully recover that sense of it being something we listen to, because we are so book based, but it would be interesting almost, wouldn't it, as a social experiment to set up a Christian community where you only listened to that, for instance, Matthew's gospel read, and what would people come up with? I mean, it would be really interesting.
Yeah, it is. Well, of course, on one's smartphone, if you have a smartphone, then if you listen to, for instance, the U version Bible, then, you know, I've quite often done that. Just press the button while I'm brushing my teeth or something, and you listen to stuff, or in the car. So you you can get that experience. I think the other thing, one of my little bugbears, my hobby horses, I shall ride.
I know what's coming.
Is the reading of the Bible in church, reading of Scripture in church.
Yeah,
you know, Paul says to Timothy, "Do not neglect the public reading of the Scriptures."
Yeah,
and actually, we could do ourselves a favor by actually having people who've practiced and deliver well reciting passages to us. And of course, you can pick up stuff online as well. There's quite a few folk who've done recitations of Scripture. So.
Yeah. And you do when you hear it read, you do hear verbal resonances much more clearly. I remember listening to Mark's Gospel once.
Oh yeah.
You know, the I think it was the feeding of the 5,000 or something, where you know, Jesus sits them down on the green grass.
Oh yeah, and you hear the green,
and you hear the green. You think, oh, I've never noticed that word before. No. And you pick up little things like that.
You do, yeah.
And you pick up repeated phrases.
He puts his head on a cushion. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so interesting,
fascinating. Well, let's turn to our passage, shall we?
Yeah.
We're actually, I think this is the only passage from this chapter we have in the lectionary, I think. And this is life of the community. So sometimes people have called this the ecclesiastical chapter, or they call Matthew the ecclesiastical gospel. We probably ought to be clear about the word ekklesia, which only occurs in the Gospels in Matthew, and in Matthew only occurs in two places.
Yes.
One of which is here.
Yeah.
Verse 17, tell it to the ekklesia. And the other, of course, is when Peter recognizes Jesus, and Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my ekklesia."
Yeah.
But we know that there's some real dangers in translating that word, don't we?
Well, yeah, I think we do, because, and in fact, I mean, the dangers are really, depending on what version of the Bible you've got, English translation you've got. I mean, my new RSV is quite problematic here, I think, really, because it says, "If another member of the church sins against you."
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, it does, which is quite extraordinary, really.
But the word ecclesia isn't even there.
No, it's not even there. No, so it's they brought it forward. Yeah, quite a problem. And
they talk about membership.
Yeah.
Oh no, that's a nightmare.
Yeah. So definitely, this is definitely a place where you want another translation. I mean, I think New RSV particularly difficult with this. It's good in many other ways, but it's not good here. But yeah, we do need to think about it, because of course it does translate. I mean, it's more that, in a sense, it's been taken over from the Septuagint, isn't it? From the Greek version of the Old Testament,
exactly,
where it describes the congregation of Israel, I suppose.
Exactly, the congregation of the sons of Israel.
Yeah, indeed. But also, it also had a meaning in secular Greek, didn't it?
Yes. So the ecclesia was where they meant the gathering of the citizens. Now, the citizens would have been free men over the age of 30, but they gathered together to make decisions about the running of the polis of the city. So and it must surely have both those resonances. So on the one, I mean, in a sense, there's a merging of those. That the congregation of the sons of Israel, the new Israel and Jesus, are those who are citizens of the kingdom.
Yes, must do.
And I think the really key thing is that, and that's why I refuse to. Actually, you don't use the word church. I used to, when I was teaching in theological college, I used to really annoy the students because I prohibited them to use the word church. Or when they were doing presentations on their placements, so they showed a picture, said, "This is the church I'm on placement at," and I said, no, that's a building. Can you show me a picture of the church?
Yes, quite, absolutely.
I got a bit predictable after a while.
Yeah, but it's a point well made, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it is, and we need to correct it, because we particularly on the fringes or outside, people looking in, they think church means either building. Oh, there's the local church, or are you going to church, or it means institution, the Church of England, and people think in institutional churches. I mean, I suppose people don't nowadays say going into the church for ordination, but all those things still hang around, don't they? So,
and I mean, it's interesting. On the other occasion this word is used in Matthew 16. I mean, Jesus does say my ecclesia, my church, or whatever.
Yes, he does.
So that's great. That's really interesting. So that this group of people who are gathered, the renewed Israel, as it were, are intimately bound up with belonging to Jesus.
Yes.
for people who
And
belong
that's
to Jesus.
that's making a big Christological claim in itself.
Massive, isn't it? It's massive. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's also identifying. So if you take the Old Testament thing, then it's identifying Jesus as the one whose people it is on the one hand, it's relational. On the other hand, if you take the Greek background, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it means that to be a member of the kingdom, to be a citizen of the kingdom, hinges on your relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
So the kingdom of God, actually, there is one place in Scripture where the kingdom is described as the kingdom of Jesus, but I can't remember where it is. It might be in the book of
there is.
Can you remember where it is?
I have.
We're not going to do a search now. Friends,
somebody will come up. I was going to say something, but if I said, I'm bound to be wrong. So I'll wait and see if I got it right when somebody comments.
Exactly. It wouldn't be the first time, James. Sorry. Yeah, so that's fascinating. So now let's go and dive into the text here.
Yeah.
And so if a brother or sister, so it's not a member of the church, a brother or sister, it's relational. And again, just
familial.
This is fascinating, isn't it? That we notice that discipleship of Jesus means this new kinship relationship. So chapter 12, people have said, oh, he's gone mad, the family want to go and go. And he says, who are my brothers, my sisters, those who hear doing the will of God. So interestingly, I've got a feeling this is quite distinctive of Matthew. I'm just saying that off the top of my head about this emphasis on brother, sister. And of course, in Matthew 25, he talks about the least of these, my brothers.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
he definitely uses the familial language a lot. I mean, it's used in Mark in that context where you just mentioned. I don't know how often it is after that, but it does come across very strongly that this paradigm, as it were, of a family for what it means to be associated with Jesus as one of his followers and so on is relentlessly used, and that's the best picture, I suppose, that Jesus can offer us of what it means to be part of him. And
of course that's another connection between the Gospels and Pauline theology, because I'd say I would say that brothers and sisters is the primary metaphor that Paul uses. He uses lots of other metaphors as well for the community, but this familiar, this kinship identity is really key. And of course, that both in Jewish and in Gentile context, that's a significant challenge in the sense that you were in Gentile culture, you were very much defined by what your family connections were.
Yes.
So if your brother or sister sins against you, go and tell him or her his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained a brother. My feeling is that the issues we've got here are less to do with technical issues around the text, although we've just noticed how the language is used, how the language is. But it's just really interesting as a kind of contrast with the way that we would normally in our culture deal with issues and relate to one another.
It is, it's quite different. We live in a highly individualistic culture now, so the notion, well, there's a whole range of things. It's not by any means comprehensive, ironically, but there's a whole range of things which you cannot say to somebody. It would be unacceptable. Where perhaps the church is being challenged to be countercultural here. So it does feel very alien, and I think that is largely due to this highly individualized idea, and also a diminishing in our culture of what it means to be brothers and sisters in Christ and having responsibility one for another. So, this whole passage is absolutely dependent on us having a very strong sense of being responsible before God to the brother or sister, doesn't it?
My immediate thought here is I wonder whether I think it's probably fair to say you and I belong fair and square in middle class culture in this country. My experience of working class culture is that that's less of an issue.
Absolutely.
I used to run a squash league at a local gym in a hotel, and it was a very mixed group of folk. And if I'd done the wrong thing, if I'd promoted one person, not promoted another, then they were on the phone and they told me straight away what my sin was. There was no hesitation there whatsoever.
It's interesting.
But also interesting that that eliminates the kind of sort of passive aggressive culture of the Church of England, or the sense of resentment that when somebody does something against us, we sort of fester with resentment and we don't say anything, or we moan to somebody else. Oh, do you know what they've done to me? Kind of thing.
Yes.
So you've got there's a directness in relationship here, isn't there?
There is, though. Of course, there is a bit of a problem, isn't there, in the original text about whether the words "against you," as it were, are original.
Yes, that's
true.
If
you're, and I think,
it's got it in. There's got that in brackets. So there's actually a lot of textual evidence that it wasn't part of the original. Yeah,
and I noticed that the NIV has changed its view on this between the 1984 edition and the 2011 edition. So the 1984 edition says, if your brother or if your brother sins against you, whereas the 2011 one says, if your brother or sister sins.
Go and then there's a little footnote.
Yeah, and it's down in footnote. And I think on the blog you probably point out that there's various sort of potential reasons for this. And I think some of the commentators point to it being original. Some try to say that it's not original. And there's various arguments here and there and everywhere. I think I'm more convinced by the it's not original than I am by the originality of it. And that, therefore, if it's not personal to you, this is perhaps a sin which is possibly because later on we discover there's 2 or 3 witnesses. It's known within a small group, but it's not known. It's not publicly widely known.
No, and the text critical issue of whether it was, when you got one manuscript variant which has it, another manuscript variant which hasn't, one of the questions that text critics ask is there a plausible way of seeing the phrase removed by a scribe, or is there a plausible way of seeing a scribe put it in? And I suppose part of the argument, part of the reason for the change there in the NIV is that it's hard to imagine a scribe deleting that, even by accident. But it isn't hard to see a scribe adding it, because they might be saying, hey, hang on a second, is Jesus really telling us we ought to go and rebuke people for general sin, as it were? Surely it's got to involve us if we're involved in it. But that is interesting. And if it is the former, if it isn't just against you, but it is a sin, then it reinforces that sense of responsibility for one another, doesn't it?
It does. And I think that because that seems to be the emphasis of the whole passage, and also, I mean, our culture would rather it. It would probably rather it said against you than it would not. So we tend to read it through the cultural lens as well.
And what it says, I mean, again, this is a pick up on Pauline theology. Paul says, bear one another's burdens. But he also says each person must bear their own burden in the same phrase. So there's a sense here in which, each of us are responsible for our own life in God, and yet because we're part of this kinship relationship, we also have I have a responsibility for your growth and holiness, and you have a responsibility for my growth and holiness. Which is quite startling, really, isn't it?
Yes, especially when you think this is not about church leaders. This is about everybody. There's no mention of leadership here. No, indeed.
We tend to think of the discipline of the community being sort of a hierarchical issue, don't we, rather than being a collective. I'll just jump up. Now you've mentioned that, I'll just jump on. There was a good quotation from Dick France, isn't there, from his NIC commentary. In a formally constituted church with an appointed leadership, it's easy for the ordinary disciple to hide behind the authority structure and leave it all to the official leaders, appealing to Cain's question, am I my brother's keeper? Because that is yes. With a comfortable assumption, the answer must be no. But this passage asserts the answer is yes. In a community of little ones, each must be concerned about and take responsibility for the spiritual welfare of the other.
Yes. Yeah.
And I would say that, again, you see, there's a connection here between, this is a very communitarian vision of the people of God. And again, I would connect that with Paul, in the sense that it's really interesting that Paul almost always only ever writes to the saints in Corinth, the saints in Ephesus. He almost never writes to the leaders. There's one exception to that. Do you know what it is? It's Philippians. It's Philippians where he
it does. Yeah, of course it is.
He mentions to the others. But by and large, Paul writes to the communities. But also, by and large, Paul does not. He urges people. He does not say, "I'm the apostle. You must do what I say." He appeals to them as brothers and sisters. That's his strategy. That's verse 15. Hooray! If this person doesn't listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's a fascinating idea, and it's got a really interesting origin, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think absolutely, because it's absolutely part of the Old Testament law, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where, within Judaism, that was how you establish, and of course, it's becomes very important in the New Testament as well, particularly at the trial of Jesus, and so on. And I think also on the blog, you probably mentioned the Book of Revelation again.
Yes, of course.
Why wouldn't you?
Yes.
But yeah, there's something important about that, and it's not. Once again, it's quite countercultural to us. We don't. That's not what we would go looking for, is it? We would. No. I don't think it's.
Yeah,
not
the phrase two or three witnesses is drawn from Deuteronomy 19.
Yeah,
and the wording is almost exactly what you find in the Greek Old Testament. But then there are also other examples in judicial context, as you say in Mark 14. It's very interesting at his trial.
Yeah,
no two witnesses could be found who would agree. And then, of course, in John 8, Jesus says, "I do not testify, witness on my own behalf, but my Father testifies with me." So there are two witnesses. And the name Jesus occurs 14 times in the Book of Revelation.
Right. So 2 times 7.
2 times 7. So 2 the number of witness, 7 the number of completeness.
Yeah.
So Jesus is the faithful witness.
Yeah.
Notice that the numerology in Revelation isn't like a extra code; it's just reinforcing what the text.
Yes, it's actually saying. Yeah.
And then the appeal to the wider community. This is where we get the word church. If he refuses to listen, tell it to the ekklesia.
Yeah.
This really struck me as rather ironic. If he refused to listen to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Well, this is a gospel written by a tax collector.
Yes.
There's a bit of an irony there, isn't there?
It's deeply ironic, especially given that Jesus has treated Gentiles and tax collectors rather well.
So he's healed the Syrophoenician woman, he's healed the centurion's servant, and he's explicitly said many will come from the east and the west, that is Gentiles, and sit at the table with Abraham. So
so he's kind of appealing to their old mentality rather than their new mentality. But absolutely ironic. Yeah.
Now then there's a slight change of focus, and I think the juxtaposition of this in verse 18 with the language of sin, I don't know if that just can lead us astray a little bit. We get this language of binding and loosing. So whatever you bind in heaven shall be bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And actually, okay, so here we do have some real complications with the text at several levels, don't we? Because we've had this language before. You and I didn't discuss it because it was when we were on holiday in August, but this came a couple of chapters earlier, didn't it?
It did in Matthew 16, of course, with Jesus' words to Peter, where he says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and so on. And yet here, and of course, some people associate that profoundly with Peter's particular calling, but of course here this calling is apparently extended to
the whole
everybody within the. And I suppose the key question is what is it that might be bound and what is it that might be loosed?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if we can't answer that, it sounds a bit like a kind of non sequitur here.
Yes.
What has this got to do? Is it about binding sins?
Yes.
Or is it actually about something else? Is it about the ordering of the church or something like that?
Yeah, well, I think the common interpretation is binding and loosing, both for Peter and for the ecclesia here, for the people, is about the forgiving and the unforgiving of sins. But actually, when you think about it, that's slightly odd language, isn't it?
It is.
Why would you bind something if that means you've forgiven? No, but binding means not forgiving, and loosing means forgiving. So I suppose the loosing makes sense in that if you forgive someone, you set them free from the sin. But I don't think it means that at all, does it?
It doesn't seem to make sense to me in that way. I mean, no, it doesn't seem to make sense to me at all in that way. I think it perhaps is more to do with the spiritual authority, perhaps. Maybe that's a good way.
Well, in fact, in the book I point out there's rabbinical background to this, which is about forbidding and permitting things within the life of the community. So in fact, it fits much more clearly with the context of how we live together in the ecclesia than it does with this particular example of forgiving sin. Now, the other thing that Dick France points out is that you've got a very odd grammatical construction here. So it's using future perfect tenses. So he actually says, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. So in other words, whereas I think the reading that we often have in these texts suggests that we make earthly decisions which then become heavenly, it's actually the other way around. It's actually about reflecting the values of heaven actually in our communal life. So Dick France says the heavenly. This is in his commentary on Matthew, where the phrase comes in Matthew 16. The heavenly endorsement of Peter's decisions is expressed in the unusual syntax of future perfect passive verbs: will have been tied up, will have been untied. With simple futures, Peter would take the initiative and heaven would follow. With future perfects, the impression is that when Peter makes his decision, it will be found to have already been made in heaven, making him not the initiator of new directions for the church, but a faithful steward of God's prior decisions. The same becomes a promise, not of divine endorsement, of a divine guidance to enable Peter to decide in accordance with God's already determined purpose, which I think makes much more sense. And in chapter 16, it also ties in with the language of the keys. The keys is not about authority. The keys is about being a steward who looks after the treasures of the kingdom, of the gospel.
I think if that's so, and I do find it convincing, then the following verse is in a sense a parallel to that. And you kind of get that impression anyway, because Jesus says again,
yes, he does. That is, that's true. Yeah, it does.
So
they belong
he's
together,
saying,
don't they?
yeah, and actually the will of God has been determined through the prayerfulness of the two or three who agree on earth about what they ask, and it will be done by the Father in heaven, because it is actually what is already right in heaven, as it were. So it's a just different way of coming at the same question.
Yeah, and again, this is a language that Paul uses in Philippians about citizenship. Your citizenship is in heaven. So there's a sense, because when he's writing to the Philippians, he's writing to, as it were, an outpost of Rome, because Philippi was established as a
military colony,
a military colony for veterans, where they would have their Roman citizenship and they'd be granted a plot of land. So Paul is kind of using that analogy and saying, hey, look, the community here on earth is kind of an outpost of heaven, of where God's will is done. And of course, one day that'll be fully revealed. But in the meantime, you're anticipating that, so that the life of your community should reflect the life of the kingdom, the life in God's presence.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating, isn't it, that this phrase, where two or three of you agree on earth about anything, it'll be done from heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Now, that's actually become a really important touchstone in terms of, people meeting together for praying, meeting in small groups. This is the only place it occurs in the New Testament, isn't it?
I think it's.
I think this is unique Matthean material.
I think it's
fascinating.
I think it is actually. I think the whole. In fact, I think the whole of this passage actually is unique to Matthew.
It is.
Yeah.
So it occurs in one place, and it's become such an important.
We put a lot of weight on it, don't we?
We really do. And I think there's a couple of things really interesting about it. One is that it's quite striking that he's been talking about the ekklesia, and of course in the Jewish context, you have to have 10 males, i.e. 10 heads of family, to form a synagogue. So the community has to be a reasonable size. So in one sense, this is something radical, in the sense of Jesus saying, where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there amongst them. It just suddenly strikes me as well, here's an anticipation as well of Matthew 28, where Jesus says, lo, I'll be with you always to the end of the earth. But of course, that's a replay of, and he'll be called Emmanuel at the beginning. So again, you have this theme through Matthew of God Emmanuel, God with us in the presence of Jesus. So when Jesus is born, that is God Emmanuel with us. Here, where two or three are gathered, God Emmanuel, God is with us. And then when he sends us out on the Great Commission, he is with us as well. So But it is quite striking. Having this two or three, isn't it?
It is, and I think one of the most important lessons I've learned in my Christian life is the power of agreeing in prayer with one other person. And I know particularly with my wife, and when we pray each morning, there is no doubt at all in my mind that the Lord answers those prayers remarkably consistently and powerfully in a way which I can always see, and that feels different from praying on my own. It's a really, really important thing, and I think it's a neglected power of the church actually, that if we took this more seriously and prayed with one another, whatever our relationships might be, power of praying trios or prayer partners, that sort of thing. Really, really important.
And there's a practical basis to that as well. So having prayer, when we have prayer ministry, we pray always with one or two other people when you're praying for somebody, so there's accountability there. I think there's a psychological dimension to it as well, isn't it? If you feel two of you agree on something, and then here Jesus is telling us in Matthew that there's a spiritual dimension to that as well. There is also, I think, last observation here is that there is another Christological dimension to it, which is that the only antecedent that I'm aware of in terms of this language is a rabbinical saying from the early 2nd century, which says that if two sit together and the words of the law, the Torah, are between them, then the Shekinah glory of God rests with them.
Yeah, it's a great quote, that. Yeah.
It is great, isn't it? Because for Matthew, then, what it means is that Jesus now takes the place of the law. The teaching of Jesus takes place of the law,
yes,
around which has constituted the community, which actually takes us back to the beginning of the passage, actually, doesn't it?
It does. And so it's essentially, it's like being in the temple for a Jew. You're in the presence of the living God.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well. So, yeah.
Wow, fascinating stuff there. James, thank you so much. Friends, I hope you found that useful. Don't forget to like, and don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click on the share button, copy and share it with others. And if there's anything there that, you've got a view on, you think we might gone wrong, or you want to expand it, make a comment, particularly find that verse where it says that the kingdom belongs to Jesus, Jesus' kingdom.
Yeah.
And look for the answers. So, James, thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you. Okay.